Murder on the Midnight Express. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore the intricate mysteries of human nature through the keen observations of our beloved detective. I'm your host, William, and today we invite you to settle in with a warm cup of tea as we follow Miss Jane Marple through one of her most perplexing cases yet. A tale of deception, identity, and the peculiar circumstances that unfold when a sharp eye catches what others miss. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Midnight Express Puzzle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the countryside as Miss Marple gazed out the window of the northbound express. She had boarded the train early that morning with one singular purpose: to visit her nephew Raymond, who had recently taken a position at a solicitor's office in Manchester. At 73 years of age, she had grown accustomed to the rhythmic clatter of train wheels, finding in it a peculiar sort of meditation that aligned perfectly with her knitting. The carriage was moderately full. Across from her sat a businessman absorbed in his newspaper, while further down, a young mother coaxed a restless child with barley sugar sweets. Miss Marple, dressed in her customary dark travelling coat and sensible hat, paid them little mind. She was absorbed in the intricate Fair Isle pattern of a cardigan she was knitting for her great niece when something caught her attention. The afternoon light was particularly brilliant that day, reflecting off the windows of a train passing on the adjacent track. As it drew alongside her own carriage, Miss Marple happened to glance toward it. What she saw made her needles falter. In one of the compartments of the passing train, visible quite clearly through the window, was a scene of violent struggle. A woman in a dark travelling dress was being grappled with by a man whose features were obscured by the angle. The woman's mouth appeared to be open as if in a cry, though no sound penetrated the sealed windows. Miss Marple's knitting fell to her lap. She pressed her face nearer to the glass, but the train was already pulling away, its speed increasing as it curved around a bend in the track. The entire incident could not have lasted more than 30 seconds, yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes had registered every detail. The woman's pearl necklace, her reddish-brown hair, the man's dark overcoat and a leather suitcase that flew from the overhead rack. Her heart quickened. Without hesitation, Miss Marple gathered her things and made her way to find the conductor. She located him near the dining car, a broad-faced man of perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing minor crises. "Excuse me," she said, touching his arm gently. "I've just witnessed something quite disturbing. On the passing train, the one that was alongside us a moment ago, there appeared to be an act of violence." The conductor's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed scepticism. "A woman being attacked? Are you quite certain, madam? These trains often create optical illusions with their speeds and reflections." "Quite certain," Miss Marple replied calmly. "A woman with reddish hair in a dark dress, a man in an overcoat. There was a struggle, and luggage was displaced." The conductor glanced toward the window, though by now the other train was far in the distance. "These things happen, madam," he said with the tone of one who had heard various fanciful claims before. "Reflections in windows, movement that appears more violent than it is. But if you'd like, I can make a note of it. The proper authorities will be informed at the next station." Miss Marple was not satisfied, but she recognised the dismissal in his voice. She returned to her seat, her mind churning. She had spent 73 years observing human nature, and she knew the difference between imagination and reality. What she had seen was real. At Manchester, the station master listened to her account with the patient indulgence one might show an elderly relation. No body had been reported anywhere along the line, he explained. No alarm had been raised on any passing train. It was entirely possible that what she had witnessed was a lover's quarrel, perhaps, or an exaggerated movement that appeared more sinister than it was. But the leather suitcase, Miss Marple pressed. It fell from the rack. "Perhaps it was being removed by the owner, madam. These things happen in trains." Miss Marple gathered her hat and bag with a small sigh. She made her way to a waiting cab, where she had arranged to stay at a modest hotel before visiting Raymond's office the following morning. The Bramble Inn was a respectable establishment near the station, the sort of place frequented by travelling salesmen and country folk visiting the city. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Hodge, welcomed her warmly enough, though Miss Marple detected in her manner a certain wariness. As Miss Marple was being led upstairs to her room, she noticed something remarkable. In the entrance hall, being carefully manoeuvred through the doorway by two porters, was a leather trunk of considerable size. Its lid hung at an odd angle, the lock clearly broken. One of the porters was making a comment about the damage, while Mrs. Hodge waved a dismissive hand. "Just a travel mishap," she said curtly. "The guest has already explained it. Get it up to room 7, will you?" Miss Marple's antennae, as it were, began to quiver. She watched as the trunk disappeared up the staircase, then turned to Mrs. Hodge with an air of casual interest. "A new guest, then? I do hope they're not too distressed about their luggage." Mrs. Hodge's expression became guarded. "Just a lady passing through. She's taken a room for 2 nights. Travelling on business or some such thing." Miss Marple did not press further, but her mind was already working. A woman with a damaged trunk arriving on the day of the incident she had witnessed. The coincidence seemed far too precise to dismiss as mere chance. That evening, Miss Marple took her dinner in the small dining room of the inn, where a handful of other guests were scattered at various tables. She deliberately positioned herself where she could observe the entrance. At 7:30, a woman entered the room. She was of middle height, blonde rather than the reddish-brown Miss Marple had observed on the train, dressed in a well-cut green travelling costume. She moved with the assured grace of someone accustomed to attention, and indeed, several heads turned to follow her progress to a corner table. Yet Miss Marple found herself leaning forward slightly. The woman's features, observed carefully, seemed somehow rearranged from what she expected, though she was uncertain how to articulate this impression. The cheekbones were the same distinctive shape, the jawline identical, but the hair, the styling, the very manner of holding herself had been transformed. Miss Marple thought immediately of the theatre. She had attended a number of theatrical productions over the years, and she was familiar with the remarkable transformations that could be achieved through costume, wigs, and cosmetics. The question that began to form in her mind was not whether this was the same woman from the train, but rather how she'd managed such a complete alteration in such a brief period of time. At that moment the woman glanced up from her menu, and her eyes met Miss Marple's across the room. For just an instant something flickered in those eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. Then the moment passed, and the woman returned her attention to her meal. Miss Marple spent much of the night awake, her mind revolving around the puzzle. A woman seen struggling on a passing train, a broken trunk arriving at an inn, a new guest with an altered appearance. These threads, she sensed, were connected, though the pattern was not yet clear. Chapter 2. The Curious Costume Changes. The morning brought no immediate clarity, but it did bring opportunity. Miss Marple, having postponed her visit to Raymond's office with a brief telephone call claiming fatigue from travel, devoted herself to the investigation at hand. She began by making discreet inquiries of Mrs. Hodge regarding the mysterious guest. A Miss Summers, the proprietor informed her, quite respectable. Didn't say much about her business, but paid in advance, which is always a good sign. Miss Marple settled herself in the small library off the main entrance, where she could observe comings and goings without being obvious about it. It was here that she began to notice something extraordinary. At regular intervals throughout the day, Miss Summers would leave the building and return approximately 20 minutes later. Each time she returned, she appeared subtly different. Once she wore a dark travelling coat and a small feathered hat. Later she appeared in a smart tweed suit with a burgundy cloche. By afternoon she had changed into a pale blue summer dress with a contrasting jacket. The transformations were neither complete nor particularly dramatic. A wig change, a different hat, a jacket worn or removed, but taken together they suggested that someone was deliberately presenting multiple versions of the same basic appearance. Miss Marple, who had spent decades observing the small details of village life, recognised the hallmark of someone engaged in deception. The question remained, why? On the afternoon of her second day at the inn, Miss Marple took a bold step. She encountered Miss Summers in the hallway and introduced herself with the straightforward courtesy of one elderly woman to another. "How do you do? I'm Miss Marple, currently staying at the inn while I visit my nephew in the city. Might I ask what brings you to Manchester? I find it such a bustling place, though not without charm." Miss Summers regarded her for a moment, and Miss Marple saw her calculate quickly whether engagement or dismissal was the safer course. She chose engagement, though her smile was careful. "Miss Summers, I'm here on theatrical business, actually. I'm something of a costume consultant, you see, advising on authenticity and transformations for a travelling production company. They're mounting several new shows this season." The lie was well constructed, Miss Marple noted, but it was a lie nonetheless. Not entirely false, but rather a partial truth dressed up to conceal something larger. The reference to theatrical work, however, was revealing. It aligned with what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. "How interesting," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I do love the theatre, though I confess I've attended precious little of it these days. Your work sounds most specialised." Over the next hour, Miss Marple and Miss Summers took tea together in the small drawing-room of the inn. Miss Marple proved to be an excellent listener, asking gentle questions that seemed to arise naturally from genuine interest rather than interrogation. She learned that Miss Summers was travelling throughout the north of England on business for a London-based production company. She'd come from Edinburgh just recently, and her schedule was quite fluid depending on the needs of her employers. Yet beneath these details, Miss Marple sensed the contours of a more complex story. The woman's hands trembled slightly when she poured her tea. There were dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of cosmetics fully concealed. She checked the lobby clock repeatedly and seemed almost relieved when Miss Marple eventually excused herself. That evening, Miss Marple made her way to the Manchester police station. She asked to speak with whoever was in charge of the local constabulary, and eventually found herself in the modest office of Inspector Garrett, a man of approximately her own age, but with the weary bearing of one who has spent 40 years managing the small catastrophes of urban life. "Inspector, I have come to bring to your attention a rather unusual matter," Miss Marple began, and she recounted precisely what she'd witnessed on the train the previous afternoon. She described the woman, the man, the struggle, and the overturned suitcase. She described her arrival at the Bramble Inn and the remarkable transformations in her appearance. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and waited. Inspector Garrett regarded her with the expression Miss Marple had come to expect, scepticism mixed with a reluctant acknowledgement that she was unlikely to waste his time with pure fabrication. "You say this woman is presently staying at the Bramble Inn?" he asked. "She is, registered as Miss Summers. I would not trouble you with this matter if I were not reasonably certain that something untoward has occurred." The inspector leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Miss Marple, is it? That's a common enough name in these parts. But you're not from Manchester, if I'm reading your accent correctly." "No, Inspector. I'm from the village of St. Mary Mead in the south. I've spent my life observing the human nature in all its manifestations, and I have developed a certain sensitivity to deception. What I observed on that train was not theatrical performance. It was genuine violence." Garrett stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the rain-dampened streets. "I'll be frank with you, Miss Marple. Without a body, without a report of a missing person, without any concrete evidence, my hands are somewhat tied. However, I appreciate your diligence. Let me look into a few things. If Miss Summers is involved in anything untoward, we'll know soon enough." But Miss Marple was already one step ahead. She had, in her time in Manchester, made a few modest inquiries of her own. She had spoken to a porter at the station who had been moving the trunk. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd overheard Mrs. Hodge speaking to someone about how the guest had asked the proprietor to dispose of a damaged railway ticket and some bloodied clothing. The porter had assumed it was from the trunk damage, but something in his tone suggested he was less certain than he claimed. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "I wonder if it might be worth investigating not simply whether a crime has occurred, but whether the crime was precisely what it appeared to be. You see, I have a theory." She proceeded to outline her suspicion. The woman on the train had been in a genuine struggle, yes, but the woman now staying at the inn might not be that woman at all. Or rather, she might be that woman and yet also be a different woman entirely. The theatrical background might be relevant. The costume changes might not be random. What if, Miss Marple suggested, two women had deliberately exchanged positions during the struggle? What if one woman had been meant to disappear, while the other had assumed her identity? The passing trains, the brief window of time, the costume change at the station stop during the darkness of the tunnel. It would be possible, with planning and coordination. Inspector Garrett's expression shifted. "You're suggesting that the person who arrived at the Bramble Inn might be the perpetrator, not the victim? Or she might be an accomplice," Miss Marple replied. "Or she might be the intended victim who has now switched places with her attacker. What I'm suggesting, Inspector, is that the matter is more subtle than it initially appeared." The following morning brought news that vindicated Miss Marple's suspicions, at least partially. Inspector Garrett appeared at the Bramble Inn with 2 constables and located Miss Summers in her room. When confronted, the woman's composure finally cracked. What emerged over the following hours of questioning was a remarkable tale of theft, substitution, and mistaken identity. Miss Summers was indeed what she had claimed, a costume consultant for a theatrical company. But she had been enlisted by a man named Ashford, a small-time criminal who had orchestrated an elaborate scheme. A shipment of valuable jewels had been in transport from Edinburgh to London via train. 2 women, physically similar enough to fool a casual observer, had been recruited. One carried the genuine jewels in a trunk, the other carried an identical trunk containing paste replicas. The struggle Miss Marple had witnessed was staged. In the confusion of the switch, the woman with the real jewels was meant to vanish, while the woman with the paste would arrive at the inn and maintain the charade long enough for Ashford to transport the real jewels elsewhere. The 2 women would then switch places again at a later date. What had gone wrong was the presence of Miss Marple and her sharp eyes. Her observations had been precise enough that the plan had begun to unravel. Miss Summers, realizing the game was nearly up, decided to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for leniency. As Inspector Garrett drove away from the inn with Miss Summers in custody, he paused to speak with Miss Marple one final time. "Your observational powers are remarkable, Miss Marple. In all my years in this profession, I've rarely encountered someone with such an eye for detail." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's nothing so extraordinary, Inspector. One simply observes what is presented and considers what might be hidden beneath the surface. Human nature is endlessly theatrical, you see. People change their costumes and their appearances not simply to dress differently, but to reveal different aspects of themselves. When those changes seem inconsistent with who someone claims to be, it is usually worth investigating further." Chapter 3. The Letters and the Truth. With Miss Summers now in police custody, one might have expected the mystery to be concluded. However, Miss Marple had learned in her lifetime that the most interesting aspects of any crime often emerged only after the initial perpetrator had been apprehended. She remained in Manchester for several additional days, ostensibly to visit Raymond, but in truth because her curiosity regarding the broader circumstances remained incompletely satisfied. Inspector Garrett, recognising in her a useful sounding board, maintained contact. He invited her to review certain documents that had been discovered in Miss Summers's room at the Bramble Inn. Chief among these was a series of letters, some received and others in draft form unsent. The first of the received letters bore the seal of a London law firm and was addressed to someone named Victoria Ashford. It contained details regarding the dissolution of a business partnership and the settlement of various financial disputes. The second letter was more personal in nature and bore all the hallmarks of a love letter, though one tinged with desperation and reproach. "Victoria," it read, "I cannot accept what you have done. We were to have built something together, something meaningful. Instead, you have betrayed me and aligned yourself with men of dubious character. The plan you have devised is madness. I will not be part of it, and I must insist that you abandon this course before it results in catastrophe." Miss Marple studied this letter with great attention. The handwriting was educated and careful, belonging to someone of intelligence and refinement. The tone spoke of a relationship that had once held promise but had deteriorated into acrimony and desperation. "Inspector," she asked, "have you identified the sender of this letter?" "We're still working on that," Garrett replied. "The signature is illegible, and there's no return address. But based on the references to London legal matters, we're investigating connections to various law firms in the city. May I inquire about the unsent letters?" Miss Marple asked. These were more curious. They appeared to be drafts of communications that the writer had begun but never completed. One began, "My dearest Richard," but was crossed out. Another started, "To whom it may concern," but trailed off into incoherence. Miss Marple read through these fragments carefully, and a picture began to form in her mind. She turned to Inspector Garrett with a gentle but firm expression. "Inspector, I believe you're searching in the wrong direction. This matter is not primarily about the theft of jewels, though that was certainly part of the scheme. This is fundamentally a crime of passion, orchestrated by someone who felt betrayed and wounded by a personal relationship that had fractured beyond repair." "What are you suggesting?" Garrett asked. "I would suggest that the person who orchestrated this entire scheme is not Miss Summers, who is merely a hired consultant, and not Mr. Ashford, who was the visible organiser. The true architect of this crime is the person to whom, and about whom these letters speak, the person named Victoria Ashford, if that is indeed her real name. Inspector Garrett's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting that Victoria Ashford orchestrated a jewel theft as some form of revenge against an intimate? Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested carefully, Victoria Ashford used the theft as a means to disappear, to escape from a situation that had become intolerable. The switch on the train, the assumption of a new identity, these are not primarily about acquiring the jewels, they're about escaping the person and the life she no longer wished to inhabit. Over the following days, investigation confirmed Miss Marple's theory with remarkable accuracy. Victoria Ashford had indeed been involved in a romantic and business relationship with a gentleman named Richard Halliday, a minor investor in theatrical ventures. When that relationship had ended acrimoniously, Halliday had made claims against her regarding money he believed she had wrongfully taken from their joint accounts. Rather than face his accusations and demands, Victoria had devised an elaborate scheme. By stealing jewels and then staging her own substitution on the train, she had arranged for her previous identity to ostensibly disappear. The woman who had arrived at the Bramble Inn under the name Miss Summers was actually Victoria Ashford, but one who had undergone such a complete physical and psychological transformation that she could, theoretically, have begun a new life entirely. The other woman, the one who had been left on the train with the paste jewels, was Halliday's sister Catherine. She too had been complicit in the scheme, agreeing to the switch so that Victoria might escape. Catherine had subsequently left the train at an intermediate station and had already fled the country by the time authorities began to piece together what had occurred. What Miss Marple found most remarkable about the case was its fundamental commentary on human desperation. Here was a woman who had felt so thoroughly trapped by her circumstances, so completely unable to resolve her situation through conventional means, that she had orchestrated an elaborate crime not primarily for gain but for the sake of transformation. The jewels were almost incidental. What Victoria Ashford truly sought was escape. When this explanation was shared with her, Miss Marple received it with a mixture of sympathy and mild sadness. "It is always so," she said to Inspector Garrett as they parted. "The greatest crimes are not committed by those who are fundamentally wicked, but by those who are desperate. Victoria Ashford undoubtedly broke the law and caused considerable trouble, yet I cannot find it entirely within myself to condemn her. She was a woman who felt that her only option for salvation was to cease being herself. That speaks to a desperation that runs very deep indeed." Inspector Garrett regarded her with renewed appreciation. "You know, Miss Marple, you would have made an excellent detective. You see beyond the surface in ways that most trained investigators cannot." Miss Marple smiled. "I am no detective, Inspector. I am merely someone who has spent a lifetime observing the patterns of human behaviour in a small village. These patterns, you see, recur everywhere. The person who steals because they are desperate is much the same whether they live in Manchester or in my little St. Mary Mead. Understanding this is not detective work. It is simply the application of knowledge about human nature to circumstances one encounters." Chapter 4. The investigation deepens. With the immediate mystery apparently resolved, Miss Marple finally visited Raymond's office. Her nephew, a competent solicitor of approximately 45 years of age, was both delighted to see her and curious about the curious timing of her visit and her extended stay in Manchester. When she explained the circumstances surrounding Miss Summers and Victoria Ashford, he found himself simultaneously impressed and alarmed. "Aunt Jane," he said over lunch at a respectable restaurant near his office, "you do have a remarkable facility for finding yourself in the midst of extraordinary situations. Most people travel to visit their relatives and simply enjoy meals and conversation. You appear to have spent your time engaged in amateur detective work. I assure you, Raymond, it was entirely unintentional. I happened to observe something unusual, and my conscience would not permit me to ignore it. Though I confess the matter proved to be far more complex than I initially suspected." Raymond shook his head with affectionate exasperation. "It always does with you. But I'm grateful truly. The authorities are grateful as well. Inspector Garrett made a point of seeking me out to thank you formally. Apparently what might have become an ongoing mystery was resolved because of your observations. It was the following day, however, that something unexpected occurred. Miss Marple was preparing to return to St. Mary Mead when Inspector Garrett sent word asking if she might spare him another hour of her time. When she arrived at his office, she found him in a state of evident agitation. "Miss Marple, There has been a development. We've received a communication from London. It appears that Victoria Ashford is not simply a woman fleeing an unfortunate personal situation. There are considerably more serious matters involved. What sort of matters? Miss Marple asked, settling into a chair. Financial fraud. Large-scale financial fraud involving several banks and investment firms. Victoria Ashford was not merely involved peripherally. She was apparently instrumental in a scheme that cost numerous investors considerable sums of money. These were not wealthy individuals speculating with surplus capital. Many of them were ordinary people who lost their retirement savings, their children's education funds, their modest inheritances. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. This changes the nature of the matter considerably. When I spoke of her desperation, I was operating under the impression that her circumstances were primarily personal. If her actions involved defrauding vulnerable people, then my sympathy requires substantial revision. Precisely, Garrett agreed. What we initially interpreted as a woman fleeing an unfortunate romantic entanglement may actually have been someone attempting to escape the consequences of serious criminal conduct. The jewel theft may not have been an escape scheme at all, but rather a cover for a far more significant crime. The investigation that followed was considerably more complex than the initial inquiry. It required cooperation with London authorities, examination of financial records, and interviews with numerous victims of the fraudulent scheme. Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of providing testimony regarding her observations of Miss Summers, information that proved useful in establishing timelines and understanding the mechanics of the escape plan. What emerged over the course of several weeks was a portrait of a woman of considerable intelligence and capability, who had chosen to use those abilities for personal enrichment at others' expense. Victoria Ashford had not stumbled into financial fraud accidentally. She had deliberately engineered it, convincing numerous investors to place their savings into schemes she represented as safe and secure while knowing them to be fundamentally unsound. The terrible irony was that several of those defrauded were elderly people, much like Miss Marple herself, people who had lived frugally their entire lives, accumulated modest but meaningful savings, and trusted in the advice of professionals they believed to be honest. To learn that they had been deliberately deceived struck Miss Marple with particular force. One evening, while waiting for her train to return to the south, she sat in the Manchester railway station and found herself thinking deeply about the nature of crime and culpability. Victoria Ashford had been driven by desperation, certainly, but that desperation had led her to make choices that caused immeasurable suffering to people who had done her no harm. When Inspector Garrett came to bid her farewell before her departure, Miss Marple shared these reflections with him. "I find myself struggling," she said, "to maintain my usual compassion for the perpetrator. Miss Ashford has revealed herself to be a woman who harmed the vulnerable deliberately and without apparent remorse. It is difficult to regard such conduct with anything but considerable moral disapprobation." Garrett nodded gravely. "The investigation continues, of course. We believe we know where her sister Catherine may be, and we're in communication with authorities in several countries regarding Victoria Ashford's possible whereabouts. She cannot hide forever. Someone of her particular talents and temperament tends to inevitably reveal themselves." As her train pulled away from Manchester Station, Miss Marple gazed out the window at the city receding into the distance. The case, she sensed, was not truly concluded. Victoria Ashford remained at large, and the patterns of deception and desperation that had motivated her had not fully resolved themselves. Somewhere, Miss Marple suspected, this mysterious woman was still engaged in some form of elaborate performance, still attempting to transform herself into someone new, still running from the consequences of her choices. Chapter 5. The Manchester Connection. The weeks that followed Miss Marple's return to St. Mary Mead were occupied with the ordinary rhythms of village life. Yet her mind remained partially engaged with the unresolved aspects of the Ashford case. She received periodic updates from Inspector Garrett regarding the investigation. Progress was steady but slow. Financial records were being painstakingly reconstructed. Victims were being identified and interviewed. The scope of the fraud was proving even larger than initially believed. It was in late autumn when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A gentleman of approximately 60 years of age, well-dressed, and bearing the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, presented himself at her cottage. His name was Sir Malcolm Hartley, and he identified himself as being engaged by the London authorities to coordinate the investigation into Victoria Ashford's financial crimes. I have read the reports regarding your observations and your assistance to Inspector Garrett, Sir Malcolm explained, as they sat in Miss Marple's parlour. I find your insights into Miss Ashford's character and methods to be of considerable interest. I wonder if I might impose upon your time to discuss certain aspects of the case that have begun to trouble me. Of course, Sir Malcolm. I'm always willing to assist in matters of justice, though I confess I'm somewhat surprised that my modest observations would be of interest to someone of your position and expertise. It is precisely your lack of official expertise that makes your observations valuable, Sir Malcolm replied. You observe as a human being rather than as a trained investigator. You see patterns that might escape someone whose mind is conditioned by professional training and institutional constraints. Over the course of the afternoon, Sir Malcolm laid before Miss Marple his concerns regarding the Ashford investigation. While the financial fraud had been extensively documented, there remained questions about how the scheme had been initiated and who else might have been involved. The question that troubles me most, he said, is whether Victoria Ashford was truly the orchestrator, or whether she was operating under the direction of someone with greater power and resources. The scale of the fraud suggests a level of coordination and technical knowledge that seems almost beyond the capacity of a single individual, even one as talented as Miss Ashford appears to have been. You believe there are others involved? Miss Marple asked thoughtfully. I believe it is highly probable. I believe Victoria Ashford was the face and the primary operative, but that she was likely being directed by someone with greater experience in financial crimes, someone, perhaps, who's still at large and still engaged in similar schemes. Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to her window, gazing out at her familiar garden. The autumn light was growing thin, and she found herself thinking about the nature of visible and invisible influence. Sir Malcolm, she said presently, tell me about Victoria Ashford's background. Who was she before she became involved in financial fraud? Where did she come from? What was her family situation? The details that emerged were illuminating. Victoria Ashford was actually born Victoria Hartley, the daughter of a man named Edward Hartley, who had himself been involved in financial schemes of questionable legality. Edward Hartley had died when Victoria was in her 20s, but not before introducing her to various criminal associates and teaching her aspects of the trade, so to speak. She's your relative, Miss Marple observed quietly. My distant cousin, Sir Malcolm acknowledged, a fact that causes me considerable personal distress. When my colleagues learned of the connection, there were suggestions that I recuse myself from the investigation. However, I've chosen to remain involved precisely because of this connection. I have a vested interest in ensuring that justice is served and that anyone else involved in similar conduct is brought to account. This, Miss Marple reflected, changed the nature of the matter considerably. Sir Malcolm was not simply pursuing a criminal for professional reasons. He was pursuing a family member, an endeavour that must surely involve considerable emotional complexity. It is possible, she said slowly, that Victoria Ashford's escape from Manchester was not merely an attempt to avoid personal consequences. If your theory is correct and she was working under the direction of someone else, then her disappearance may have been orchestrated by that person. It may have been a way of removing a liability, or it may have been a way of allowing her to establish herself in a new location, to continue the scheme under different circumstances. Sir Malcolm leaned forward intently. That is precisely my thinking, Miss Marple, which is why I have come to you. I understand that you have developed a remarkable facility for understanding the psychology of deception. If you were Victoria Ashford, if you were attempting to disappear and assume a new identity, while continuing to operate some form of criminal enterprise, where would you go? How would you begin to rebuild? This was a considerably more complex question than Miss Marple had anticipated. It required her to think not simply about observation but about prediction, about the interior landscape of a criminal mind. She spent some time in contemplation before responding. She would require several things, Miss Marple said at length. She would need financial resources to support herself while she established her new identity. She would need social connections that could provide legitimacy and cover for her activities. She would need to place herself in an environment where her background could be concealed and where financial transactions might attract less scrutiny. These requirements suggest what precisely, Sir Malcolm asked. They suggest that she would likely seek to establish herself in a place with a large and transient population, where she could assume a new identity without attracting particular attention. A city larger than Manchester, perhaps, London, or one of the great coastal towns. She would likely position herself within social circles of sufficient affluence that her presence would not raise questions about the origins of her wealth. She would probably involve herself in some form of enterprise that would allow her to operate somewhat independently, but also to cultivate the connections necessary for larger criminal schemes. And how would one locate such a person, Sir Malcolm pressed? That is considerably more difficult. One would need to look for patterns of her behaviour that are distinctive to her personality. Victoria Ashford has demonstrated a particular facility for deception through transformation. She changed her appearance on the train, assumed the identity of Miss Summers, and deceived people through theatrical presentation. If her fundamental temperament has not changed, she would likely continue to employ similar methods. One would look, therefore, for someone who appears to be involved in theatrical or performance-related activities, who has access to resources beyond what her stated circumstances would normally provide, and who demonstrates an unusual facility for assuming different identities and personas. Chapter 6. The Coastal Town Revelation. Armed with Miss Marple's insights, Sir Malcolm and Inspector Garrett expanded their investigation to include several coastal towns and larger metropolitan areas. The search proved frustrating at first, yielding numerous false leads and dead ends. However, approximately 2 months after Sir Malcolm's visit to St. Mary Mead, information emerged that proved significant. A woman matching Victoria Ashford's physical description had appeared in Brighton approximately 6 weeks after her disappearance from Manchester. She'd identified herself as Margot Sinclair, a theatrical producer and consultant. She had established herself in a fashionable house near the seafront and had begun to cultivate connections with various wealthy and prominent individuals in the town. The breakthrough came when one of the victims of the original fraud, an elderly widow named Mrs. Eleanor Parsons, happened to encounter this woman at a social gathering in Brighton. Mrs. Parsons recognised her immediately, despite the physical alterations. The woman had darker hair now, and her manner of dress and comportment had changed substantially, but there was something in her voice, in her bearing, that triggered recognition. Mrs. Parsons had immediately contacted the authorities, and within days Brighton police had placed the woman under discreet surveillance. The information was relayed to Inspector Garrett, who contacted Miss Marple with the news. He asked if she would be willing to travel to Brighton to view the subject and provide her assessment of whether this was indeed the Victoria Ashford she had encountered indirectly through the Manchester investigation. Miss Marple, despite her advancing years, agreed. She made the journey to the seaside town on a cold December afternoon. Inspector Garrett and a policewoman named Detective Constable Margaret Walsh met her at the station. Over tea, they briefed her on what they had learned. Margot Sinclair, the woman claimed to be, had positioned herself at the centre of a theatrical society in Brighton, one devoted to experimental and avant-garde productions. She had cultivated friendships with several wealthy patrons, and had begun to involve them in theatrical investments that, upon cursory examination, appeared legitimate but that closer scrutiny suggested were following patterns similar to those of the Manchester fraud. More concerning, they had discovered that she was maintaining contact with several individuals connected to criminal enterprises in London. The nature of these communications suggested that she was not simply engaged in independent fraud, but was rather part of a larger criminal organisation. That evening, Miss Marple attended a performance at the Brighton Theatre, where Margot Sinclair was present with an entourage of wealthy acquaintances. From her seat in the audience, Miss Marple observed the woman carefully. The physical similarities to the woman she had observed at the Bramble Inn were present but subtle. The hair was darker, the makeup applied with slightly different technique, the clothing in a more fashionable modern style. But as she watched, Miss Marple became increasingly certain. It was not simply the physical features, though those were consistent. It was the quality of attention, the way the woman observed her companions, the manner in which she calculated effects and responses. There was a theatrical quality to even her most casual interactions, as if she were constantly performing a role and assessing the audience's response to her performance. When the performance concluded and the audience was mingling during intermission, Detective Constable Walsh managed to position Miss Marple where she might observe Margot Sinclair more closely. The woman was engaged in conversation with a wealthy gentleman who appeared to be entirely under her spell. She laughed at his remarks with a quality of delight that seemed genuine, but that Miss Marple sensed was carefully calibrated for effect. "It is her," Miss Marple whispered quietly to Detective Constable Walsh. "I cannot doubt it. The physical alterations are substantial, but the fundamental personality remains unchanged. She is still performing, still calculating, still engaged in the careful manipulation of those around her." The following morning, Inspector Garrett requested that Miss Marple meet with him and a detective superintendent from London named William Chadwick. Superintendent Chadwick was a formidable man of approximately 60, with the bearing of someone who had encountered nearly every variety of criminal activity and sophistication. "Your observations at the Brighton theatre confirmed what we had begun to suspect," he explained. "This woman is indeed Victoria Ashford, and she is currently engaged in orchestrating a new scheme that is significantly more ambitious than the Manchester fraud. We have strong reason to believe that she's not acting independently, but rather as the primary operative for a larger criminal organisation. The question that now faces us is how to proceed. We have probable cause to arrest her, but we have limited evidence that would be sufficient for conviction. If we move too quickly, we risk apprehending her while allowing her associates to remain at large. If we move too slowly, we risk allowing the scheme to proceed to a point where the damage becomes irreversible." Miss Marple considered this dilemma. "Inspector Garrett," she said, "what was it that ultimately caused Miss Summers to cooperate with you in Manchester? What was the critical factor that prompted her to provide information?" Garrett reflected for a moment. She came to understand that the game had been discovered, that continued resistance was pointless. More importantly, I believe she came to fear the man orchestrating the scheme, this Ashford or whoever it was she was working for. When confronted with a choice between cooperation with authorities and continued vulnerability to her criminal associates, she chose cooperation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then I believe I understand what course of action might prove most effective. Victoria Ashford is at her core a performer, a person who has built her life around deception and transformation. What she fears most is exposure, not necessarily legal consequence, but the revelation of her true nature to the people whose esteem and trust she has cultivated. If that exposure could be engineered in such a way that she perceived her position as irretrievably compromised, she might be persuaded to cooperate, much as Miss Summers did." Over the following days, Miss Marple, in concert with the authorities, engineered an elaborate performance of her own. A distinguished gentleman, played by an undercover detective, was introduced into Margot Sinclair's social circle. He positioned himself as a potential investor with substantial capital available for theatrical ventures. He cultivated an acquaintance with Victoria Ashford and suggested a private meeting to discuss a potentially lucrative investment opportunity. During this meeting, which was carefully monitored by authorities positioned outside the building, the undercover detective presented Margot Sinclair with purported documentation of her Manchester activities, her true identity, and her criminal history. He suggested that various members of her social circle had been made aware of this information, and that her position of trust and esteem in Brighton society was now irretrievably compromised. What followed was precisely what Miss Marple had anticipated. Confronted with exposure and faced with the dissolution of the carefully constructed identity she had created, Victoria Ashford's resistance collapsed. She agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a degree of protection and reduced prosecution. Chapter 7. The Confession Unravels. Once Victoria Ashford had agreed to cooperate, the full scope of the criminal enterprise began to emerge. What had initially appeared to be individual acts of fraud perpetrated by a talented but unaligned criminal was revealed to be part of a far more extensive and sophisticated operation. Victoria Ashford was, as Miss Marple had intuited, part of a criminal network that extended throughout England and into Europe. The network specialised in theatrical and cultural fraud, targeting wealthy individuals who had both the means and the inclination to invest in cultural enterprises. The network identified promising schemes, gathered investors, and then exploited both the schemes and the investors through carefully orchestrated fraud and embezzlement. Victoria Ashford's role in this network was both central and somewhat unusual. She possessed a combination of theatrical talent, financial acumen, and psychological insight that made her exceptionally well suited to cultivating investors and earning their trust. But she also served as a potential liability. If discovered, she would be immediately recognisable, and her exposure would potentially compromise the entire operation. This, Miss Marple understood, was the reason for her escape from Manchester. She was being removed from circulation before her activities could attract the attention of authorities. The plan had presumably been for her to remain in Brighton for an extended period, cultivating relationships and setting up new schemes while remaining below the notice of law enforcement. Once sufficient information had been gathered and schemes had been set in motion, she would have been moved again to another town, another social circle, another identity. What Victoria Ashford had not anticipated was the presence of Mrs. Eleanor Parsons at the Brighton social gathering, or the fact that her own talent for transformation would prove ultimately insufficient to disguise her identity completely from someone who'd previously encountered her. As Victoria Ashford provided information about her associates and her methods, a picture emerged of considerable criminal sophistication. The leader of the network was a man named Dr. Edmund Ashford, who was not, as might be suspected, a relation to Victoria, but rather her former employer and the architect of the scheme in which she had become involved years earlier. Dr. Ashford had recognised in Victoria the qualities of someone who could be moulded into an exceptionally effective tool for his purposes. He had deliberately cultivated her criminal talents, introducing her to the principles of financial fraud, the psychology of manipulation, and the art of theatrical deception. He had, in effect, created her as a criminal asset. When the investigation into the Manchester fraud had begun, Dr. Ashford had made the decision to withdraw Victoria from that operation and relocate her to Brighton, where she could continue her work under a new identity, while the initial fraud investigation gradually exhausted itself through lack of immediate leads. The discovery of Victoria Ashford in Brighton had therefore inadvertently exposed the entire network. Within weeks, coordinated police actions across multiple jurisdictions resulted in the arrest of numerous members of the criminal enterprise, including Dr. Edmund Ashford himself. Miss Marple found herself observing this cascade of consequences with mixed feelings. Justice, it seemed, was being served. The criminals were being apprehended, the victims would potentially receive some form of restitution, and the criminal network was being disrupted. And yet she could not entirely escape a sense of sadness at the trajectory of Victoria Ashford's life. The woman had possessed genuine talents, real intelligence, and considerable charisma. Under different circumstances, those qualities might have been directed towards legitimate and constructive endeavours. Instead, they had been channeled into deception and exploitation by a man who recognised in her a tool to be used and then discarded when it became convenient to do so. When Inspector Garrett saw Miss Marple off from Brighton, she shared these reflections with him. "What strikes me most forcefully," she said, "is that Victoria Ashford is both perpetrator and victim. She has caused genuine suffering to vulnerable people, and for that she must be held accountable. Yet she is also a person who was deliberately moulded into a criminal instrument by someone of greater power and intelligence. Both things are true simultaneously, and this complexity does not diminish her culpability, but neither does it permit us to regard her with simple condemnation." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "You have a remarkable facility for holding such contradictions in mind, Miss Marple. Most of us find it easier to regard criminals as simply wicked or simply unfortunate. You seem able to see them as fully human, which makes the moral judgment more difficult but also more nuanced." Chapter 8. The Trial and Aftermath. The subsequent trials of Victoria Ashford and her co-conspirators stretched across several months. Miss Marple found herself called upon to provide testimony regarding her observations during the Manchester incident and her insights into Victoria Ashford's psychological profile. She approached her appearances in court with the same careful attention to truth and precision that characterised all of her observations. The trial revealed much that had been hidden. Financial records were reconstructed showing the movement of funds through a complex series of accounts and entities. Testimony from victims detailed the personal impact of the fraud. Experts in financial crimes explained the sophistication of the schemes and the difficulty of detecting them without careful attention to detail and pattern recognition. Victoria Ashford herself testified regarding her involvement in the schemes and her awareness of the broader criminal network of which she had been a part. Her testimony was at once compelling and unsettling. She spoke with complete honesty about her actions, demonstrating no apparent remorse but also no effort to minimize her culpability. It was as if, once released from the necessity of maintaining a persona, She had reverted to a state of psychological authenticity that was simultaneously candid and disturbing. When asked by the prosecutor why she had participated in schemes that she must have known caused genuine suffering to vulnerable people, she responded with unexpected directness, "Because I was trained to understand people as instruments, as means to achieve ends, not as ends in themselves. Dr. Ashford taught me to observe human nature with a kind of cold precision, to identify needs and desires in others, and to exploit those needs and desires for financial gain. It was a perspective that he inculcated so thoroughly that I ceased to perceive my victims as fully human. They were simply obstacles or resources to be manipulated." The prosecutor then asked whether, in the time since her arrest, her perspective had changed. Victoria Ashford was silent for a long moment before responding. "I have had considerable time to contemplate the consequences of my actions. I am aware intellectually that I have caused suffering. Whether I have truly come to feel remorse for that suffering, or whether I am simply mimicking the appearance of remorse, is something I cannot determine with certainty. The facility for performance that Dr. Ashford cultivated in me is so thorough that I cannot distinguish between genuine emotion and skillful presentation of it." This testimony, Miss Marple felt, was perhaps the most honest and disturbing thing she had heard throughout the entire proceedings. It suggested a level of psychological damage that went far beyond simple moral culpability. It suggested a person who had been so thoroughly trained in deception that authenticity had become impossible for her. Following the conclusion of the trials, Miss Marple was invited to meet with Sir Malcolm Hartley at his London office. He wished to express his gratitude for her assistance and to inform her of the broader consequences of the investigation. "The criminal network that we disrupted," he explained, "was considerably larger than initially suspected. The arrest of Dr. Ashford and the testimony provided by Victoria Ashford have enabled authorities across several countries to move against associated criminal enterprises. The immediate damage prevented by this investigation likely amounts to millions of pounds. More significantly, the investigation has illuminated the methods and modus operandi of a particular category of financial criminals who target vulnerable populations. This information has been shared with financial institutions and regulatory authorities with the expectation that it will prove useful in preventing similar schemes in the future." Miss Marple received this information with a sense of satisfaction tempered by underlying weariness. The good that had been achieved was real, but it was also incomplete. The underlying vulnerabilities that had permitted the schemes to succeed in the first place remained. Elderly people with limited financial sophistication, desire to invest in cultural enterprises, and trust in authority figures would continue to be targets for criminals of similar sophistication. Sir Malcolm seemed to perceive something of this in her expression. "You are thinking," he said, "that while we have addressed the immediate criminal threat, we have not truly addressed the conditions that permitted the threat to arise." "That is precisely what I'm thinking," Miss Marple acknowledged. "Dr. Ashford did not create the vulnerability. He merely exploited it. And there are others who, having observed how the scheme operated and why it was ultimately successful, will seek to refine and repeat similar operations. The arrest of one criminal network does not eliminate the existence of criminal networks as such." Sir Malcolm sighed. "You're correct, of course. The role of law enforcement is reactive rather than preventive. We respond to crimes that have been committed rather than transforming the social conditions that permit crimes to be committed. It is a limitation that we work within, but that we cannot overcome through investigation and prosecution alone." As Miss Marple travelled back to St Mary Mead, she found herself reflecting on the entire chain of events that had begun with her observation of a struggle through the window of a passing train. That single observation had ultimately led to the disruption of a significant criminal enterprise and the apprehension of numerous dangerous individuals. And yet the quality of her satisfaction was diminished by the knowledge that her singular case, however comprehensively resolved, was merely one instance of a pattern that would continue to repeat itself. Chapter 9. The Village Reflection. Winter had settled over St Mary Mead by the time Miss Marple had fully returned to her usual rhythms of village life. The case that had occupied so much of her attention seemed increasingly remote, displaced by the ordinary concerns of country living, the illnesses and recoveries of neighbours, the small scandals of village society, the satisfaction of her garden as it settled into dormancy. Yet something had shifted within her as a result of her experience. she found herself observing her neighbours with a heightened awareness of the complexity beneath the surface of ordinary village life. The respectable widow who spoke frequently of her late husband's financial prudence was, she now realised, potentially vulnerable to financial exploitation by someone of sufficient skill and understanding of human nature. The young man from the village who had moved to London and maintained periodic contact with his parents might, under different circumstances, become entangled with criminal enterprises that he did not fully understand. These observations did not make Miss Marple cynical or distrustful in her dealings with others. Rather, they deepened her capacity for compassion. She came to understand that nearly everyone possessed vulnerabilities, areas of judgment in which they could be misled or exploited. Victoria Ashford had succeeded not because her victims were stupid or foolish, but because she was exceptionally skilled at identifying and manipulating those vulnerabilities. One evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Detective Constable Margaret Walsh, the policewoman who had assisted in the Brighton investigation. She had travelled to St Mary Mead specifically to see Miss Marple and to deliver a message from Inspector Garrett. The inspector wanted you to know, Detective Constable Walsh explained, that the information provided by Victoria Ashford has already begun to yield results. 3 additional criminal networks have been identified and disrupted based on the patterns and methods she described. The number of potential victims who have been spared as a result of her cooperation is substantial. Miss Marple received this information with a sense of quiet gratification. She offered Detective Constable Walsh tea and they spoke for some time about the nature of criminal investigation and the possibility of reform within criminal justice systems. "Is Victoria Ashford being treated fairly in her imprisonment?" Miss Marple asked. "As fairly as one treats someone convicted of substantial crimes," Detective Constable Walsh replied. "She's in a secure facility, of course, but she's not subjected to particular harshness. The director of the prison has actually been quite interested in her as a subject of study. Her psychological profile is unusual enough to be of interest to various experts in criminology and forensic psychology." Miss Marple nodded. "I suspect she does not find imprisonment as distressing as an ordinary criminal might. She has spent her life in confined spaces of a sort, imprisoned within the necessity of maintaining deceptive personas. The actual walls of a prison may feel less restrictive to her than the psychological walls she has always inhabited." After Detective Constable Walsh had departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her contemplation of the fire. She thought about Victoria Ashford, likely seated in a prison cell somewhere, and about Dr. Ashford, similarly confined. She thought about the victims whose trust had been exploited and whose financial security had been threatened or destroyed. She thought about the intricate web of circumstances and choices that had led to the entire sequence of events. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as they always did. The pattern she was working on was a complex one, intricate in its design but ultimately comprehensible through the simple repetition of basic stitches. Human life, she thought, was not entirely dissimilar. The events that composed a life, even a life as extraordinary as that of Victoria Ashford, were built from relatively simple humanitarian motivations and responses. What made them complex was the number of these basic elements interacting, creating patterns that could appear impossibly intricate. Yet with attention and patience, those patterns could ultimately be understood, and in understanding them, one came to understand not simply the individuals involved, but something fundamental about human nature itself. Chapter 10. The Final Stitch. Spring came to St Mary Mead, bringing with it the renewal of growth and the return of warmth to the earth. It had been nearly a year since Miss Marple's journey to Manchester, and the incident on the train that had set in motion a chain of investigations and revelations. The case had been thoroughly concluded, trials had concluded, sentences had been imposed, and appeals had been exhausted. The criminal enterprise had been disrupted, though other, similar enterprises undoubtedly continued in other places under the direction of other criminal minds. It was during this spring that Miss Marple received a letter. It arrived without any apparent external indication of its origin, though the postmark indicated it had been sent from the prison where Victoria Ashford was currently incarcerated. The letter was written in a careful, educated hand, and its contents were unexpected and thought-provoking. "Dear Miss Marple, I've been informed that you were the person instrumental in discovering my presence in Brighton and in initiating the chain of events that has led to my current circumstances. I wanted to address you directly, though I understand that any correspondence I receive is monitored by prison authorities. I have spent considerable time in this cell reflecting on my life and the circumstances that have brought me to this place. I have attempted to determine at what point the trajectory of my life became irreversible, at what moment I ceased to be a person capable of authentic choice and became instead an instrument of Dr. Ashford's designs. The honest answer is that I cannot identify such a moment with precision. It seems rather that the transformation occurred gradually through the accumulation of small compromises and rationalizations, until one day I discovered that I could no longer distinguish between my authentic self and the personas I had assumed. I've thought often of our brief encounters, yours and mine. I was never directly aware of your presence during the events in Manchester and Brighton, and yet your observations, your capacity for seeing beyond surface appearances, was what ultimately brought about the exposure of my activities. What I wish to convey to you is a kind of gratitude. I do not expect you to understand this, and I'm not certain that I understand it myself with complete clarity. But it seems to me that the exposure of my activities, while painful and consequential, has also in some strange way resulted in a form of liberation. I'm no longer required to maintain the elaborate deceptions that characterized my life. I am confined physically, yes, but in some manner of speaking I am less confined psychologically than I have ever been. I wonder whether you might find this observation strange, or whether, given your evident capacity for understanding the complexities of human nature, you might perceive something approaching truth in it. Yours with a kind of respect that I do not fully comprehend, Victoria Ashford. Miss Marple read this letter several times, sitting by her window with the spring light illuminating the page. The letter troubled her in ways she found difficult to articulate. It suggested a level of self-awareness and honesty that she had not anticipated from Victoria Ashford. It also suggested that the woman's incarceration might serve some purpose beyond simple punishment or containment, that it might provide a space within which genuine reflection and transformation might become possible. She did not respond to the letter. She did not feel competent to do so, nor did she believe that a response was truly necessary. The letter seemed complete in itself, a statement that required no reply. Over the following months, Miss Marple gradually returned to the ordinary rhythms of village life. The investigation that had occupied so much of her attention receded into memory and became simply another episode in a long life of observation and understanding. The knitting pattern she worked on became progressively more intricate, and her hands, though they moved somewhat more slowly than they once had, continued their steady work. One evening in late summer, as Miss Marple was completing a particularly complex Fair Isle pattern that she had been working on for several months, she found herself thinking about the nature of human transformation and the possibility of redemption. The pattern, which had seemed impossibly intricate when she had begun it, had gradually revealed itself to be constructed from simple, repeated stitches. The appearance of complexity emerged not from the individual stitches, but from their cumulative effect and their careful arrangement. She thought of Victoria Ashford, imprisoned but perhaps, in some sense, freed. She thought of the victims whose lives had been disrupted by fraud and deception. She thought of the criminal networks that had been disrupted, but whose underlying conditions remained, ensuring that new networks would eventually emerge to exploit similar vulnerabilities. And she thought of her own role in these events, the way that a single observation pursued with patience and care had ultimately led to consequences that rippled far beyond what could have been anticipated at the outset. The knitting pattern was complete. She held it up to the light and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime in this craft. It was flawless, or as close to flawless as any human creation could be. The stitches were even, the colours harmonious, the pattern coherent and complete. She folded the completed garment carefully and placed it in a drawer where she kept items intended as gifts. Tomorrow she would begin a new pattern, something different but constructed, ultimately from the same basic stitches that all knitting employed. In the village of St. Mary Mead, as in all villages, life continued in its complex patterns of interaction and consequence. Some patterns would ultimately reveal themselves as designs of extraordinary beauty and meaning. Others would reveal themselves as designs born of desperation and deception. Yet all were composed, ultimately, of the same basic elements. Human hearts seeking security and meaning, human minds capable of both generosity and cruelty, human choices that rippled outward in ways that could never be fully anticipated or contained. Miss Marple, having gazed into the depths of one particularly intricate design born of deception and crime, settled back into her cottage with the knowledge that her observations and her understanding would continue to serve a purpose. There would be other mysteries, other occasions when her capacity for seeing beneath the surface would prove useful. For now, she was content to wait, to observe, and to continue her knitting. The rhythms of the needles continued their steady click, marking time not with hours or days, but with the completion of patterns, one stitch following another in the endless progression that constituted life well observed and thoroughly understood. The end.